Certainly when you look at Galatians, it seems to conflict with what I said regarding the nature of Paul's apocalyptic theology. It seems that there's very little apocalyptic in Paul's theology on first glance, and yet I don't think that that's necessarily the case. Certainly in the first few verses in in verse 4 of chapter 1, you get the notion of being delivered from the present evil age and so forth. But I think that the main thrust of the letter, which doesn't deal with the apocalyptic symbolism to the degree that I've mentioned it as a whole in a thematic way throughout Paul's thought, is because of the acute nature of the problem that he's dealing with in Galatians that you bring out so well. And yet the contours of it in respect to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, which stems from the revelation of Christ, which is at the forefront of Paul's theology, theology of revelation, which comes right at the beginning of the letter in respect to the foregoing of salutations to different individuals, thanksgiving and so forth of those whom he recognizes. Paul gets straight into the material and then starts to weave his argument right the way through the first few chapters of Galatians because of the seriousness of the situation that he's dealing with. From that standpoint, I don't think that it forbears the notion of an apocalyptic theology, but rather it actually delves into it and brings out its implications from the standpoint of the significance of the what you might call the human-oriented, if I can say that, element of faith in respect to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ and its implications within a Jewish context. The only point that I really want to just focus on for a few minutes is the connection of the letter from the first part to the second part. And I'm thinking of it in two ways. What we normally do, or what I've done in the past, is to sort of look at the letter like I'll give you two examples. One is the way that I've looked at Ephesians in the past. I tend to look at Ephesians as a doctrinal statement in the first three chapters, and then an exhortation in the way to behave in chapters 4 through 6, so that you have a doctrine, a grounding of what it means to understand who Christ is in terms of the unification of Jew and Gentile in the first three chapters, and then chapters 4 through 6 is how to live in the light of that in a very practical way in chapters 4 through 6. And so I've tended to approach Galatians like that in chapters 1 through 4 being very strong doctrinally, and then chapters 5 and 6 in how you live that out, practically speaking, doctrinally. But that raises a few problems, as I shall mention in a minute. And the other element of that, which relates to how to interpret it, came across to me in how I interpreted the Sermon on the Mount. Years ago, I used to interpret the Sermon on the Mount through what I'd call a Reformation understanding of chapter 5, verses 17 following, which is basically the Sermon on the Mount was an impossible thing to do in the way that Jesus heightened the scribal or Pharisaic understanding of the law, and basically saying, if you think that it's difficult to understand and interpret and practice the law, then let me give you my interpretation of it, which is much deeper and much more intense. That murder is not simply carrying out the act, but is the intent of the act that goes within the heart. Likewise with adultery, it's not the act of intercourse, it's the intent of wanting to commit intercourse with someone, and so forth. And so therefore the only way that you can really fulfill the commands of the law from a messianic standpoint, in other words the Messiah's interpretation of it, is to have a different kind of righteousness than the Pharisees, which is basically to accept the Messiah Jesus. And I accepted that interpretation, which was basically a Reformation interpretation of it, so that I had a different kind of righteousness, until I realized, and I could be wrong on this, but I realized that, especially at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus gives that parable, in which he actually draws you back to the Sermon on the Mount by saying, those who do these things are people who actually build their lives upon the rock. And those who don't do these things that I've said are people who build their lives upon the sand. So doing the things that Jesus has said is part of being perfect, chapter 5, verse 48, being complete, teleos in Greek. And so therefore, what he's saying is that you are to practice these. I'm thinking of Jewish Christians, who the letter was primarily written to, I think, is a way then of fulfilling it. In other words, you are to follow the law as Jewish Christians through the interpretation of Messiah Jesus, which does not preclude faith whatsoever. It's the basis of faith, but it doesn't absolve you of actually practicing the law. In other words, then you interpret it in a different way. And now I'm using that as an analogy, those two analogies I've given you, to interpret or try to interpret then the problem of how do you put together Galatians 1 through 4 with chapter 5, because you have that very tight, convoluted argument from chapters 1 through the end of chapter 4 in Galatians. And then in chapter 5 you have the movement towards a problem, it seems to be there, in the way that people are living, and then the solution to that problem. The problem in terms of people who are biting and devouring one another in division and in a fleshly lifestyle of jealousy and dissension and carousing and drunkenness and all the rest of it. And then the solution being living according to the Spirit in respect to patience and peace and so forth in verse 23 and following of chapter 5. The question then is, does that bear any relationship to what's gone on in the first 4 chapters, or is this a different problem? For example, Charles Cusa, in his commentary on Galatians, takes the view that this is a different group of people than what he's addressing in what Paul's addressing in the first 4 chapters, because he's dealing now with a sort of an antinomian group who are feeling the freedom in Christ to the point where they don't feel that there are any ethics that will actually control them. So they're living according to the flesh. And it seems to be such a difficult situation, because you would think that those who are adhering to the law in the way that Paul is combating them, in other words, they're advocating circumcision and living under the law, which would mean then that they are not involved in these works of the flesh that's mentioned in chapter 5, verse 19 following, would not be the ones who are under condemnation, but it's a different group. And I think I accepted that for a long time, because I couldn't put it together. But I've recently come under, I think probably under the notion of the covenantal nomism, that I accept that it is those. I think it makes more sense to say that it's those who are the Judaizers who are being referred to. It makes more sense in the context. And I'm not going to do it, but you could go through chapter 5 and find numerous instances that can be connected with the first few chapters to show the manner in which the the way that Paul connects circumcision with the idea of the flesh and the significance of that in respect to the significance of pride. And probably I would bring in the idea from Romans in terms of what the flesh does in terms of the law as a basis from which to promulgate the notion of giving the flesh the ability to be able to see what it is that is at stake in respect to what is now knowledge of what is evil and what is the power of evil over the individual, so that the individual has the knowledge of what evil is but is not able to overcome it, because the law defines what evil is but doesn't give you the power to overcome it, which is a particular interpretation of the law. I'm not sure whether that comes out in, well, you could argue it comes out in the latter part of Galatians chapter 3 in terms of the law being a sort of a guardian or a teacher, a tutor in a sense, for the pupil. But I think that makes sense then in a way in which the law then is something that leads to division and can lead to the kind of statements that Paul talks about, certainly to an extreme. And I think that it's a bit of a problem, because it looks like that he's gone to excess there, and perhaps it's hyperbolic. I don't think so. Perhaps what he's doing there is he's using the situation against himself, with the way that they are upset at him and railing opposition against him to the point of division, of saying he's not a Christian, he's preaching a false gospel, he's going against the Jerusalem leaders, etc. All that stuff you can read back from chapter 2 and so forth. And so Paul is using that to say that's an example of their division and their jealousy and so forth, rather than thinking of it in individual terms of what people are doing, which doesn't make as much sense to me in respect to using that argument of saying, look, what they're doing is an indication of their position in terms of advocating circumcision, which is of the flesh, and that leads to these other elements of the flesh as they live under the law. Now, one of the arguments perhaps against it is the argument in chapter 3, which says that those who live under the law have to complete and follow all the works of the law, which then seems to go against covenantal nominalism and back to that sort of Reformation understanding of following all the works of the law. But I've never thought that. Well, I suppose I did at one point. I've never really thought that Jews had to actually think that they had to do everything under the works of the law, and that the sort of the kind of things that you get in Protestant fundamentalism of people like Ray Comfort I've come across on TV evangelism, who basically will say if you commit one sin, then you're completely separated from God. One sin, just one sin. So if you do one thing wrong under the law, then you're separated from God. I don't see that. I see the covenant that was established at Sinai as a covenant of grace. So when Paul talks in those terms of that if you follow the law, you must do all things under the law, then he's talking in a general way in respect to that you must follow then all the things that are under the law. And it's not a question of you omitting one single thing. It's a question of you omitting many things because you can't actually follow the things that are under the law, and the nation of Israel has shown that, and the present experience of Israel has shown that, and so that you need something else, because the law was never meant to establish you in salvation. It was meant to give you the grace of God that would lead you to what has occurred now, which is the seed, Galatians 3, of Christ, because the seed of Abraham is the seed that is Jesus Christ. That's a shortened form of what I think is what Paul is saying, in a sense. So you see what I'm saying there. I'm trying to marry then the first 4 chapters of Galatians with chapter 5 to make it a consistent whole that makes sense of what you might call the exhortation, or the practical side, so to speak, which is not the practical side, but is the doctrinal side that is practically intent in terms of how the Christians are to live. See what you think. Thank you.